to this video. This is part of a series of videos that I'm doing on LambdaMOO. There are two videos that come before this that I think you should watch if you're new to LambdaMOO. The first one discusses how to install LambdaMOO from scratch, building the source code, where to get it, things like that. The second talks about applying server patches and utilizing the LambdaCore Database. The database that comes with your LambdaMOO is, there's MinimalDB. MinimalDB basically has the smallest amount of objects and verbs that you could possibly get. It's not very good for building a game or any kind of MOO type application. The reason behind that is that it's really got nothing. The LambdaCore is much better. It is a database dump with a bunch of things, stripped out from the LambdaMOO game or virtual environment. I'm not sure what they like to call themselves, but it contains all the things that you might need to get started, and a lot of verbs that are written in the MOO programming language that you can review to learn how to code in MOO. You might notice me using some commands that don't actually exist. Excuse me while I move my cat. So you might notice me use or reference some verbs that the MOO that I'm running will tell me don't exist. I apologize for that. I've been coding on a game called Syndom for the last 12 or 13 years, and we have a lot of built-in functions or specifically referenced verbs and objects that the LambdaCore does not have. So I'll try to minimize that, and I'll explain when I do try to reference something that doesn't exist. A lot of the times it does exist, but we just call it something different, or we've aliased it in a shorthand way. And I'll show you how to do that kind of aliasing in this video or a future video. So at this point, you should be, you'll notice that I'm in a web browser. I'm actually connected to a MOO that's running on an EC2 instance, Ubuntu 14.04, which I installed in the previous videos. I'm using what's called Domme Client. It is created by this guy Java Chili, who is also a coder on Syndom. He's a really genius, smart coder. And what we realized with Syndom was that a huge barrier to entry was needing to download a specialized client to actually access the game. We were capping out at 20 to 25 people online, but when we introduced a web client, instead of having to use VMOO or Atlantis or even Telnet to connect to the game, we saw that our player retention increased, and we've gotten up to about 60 to 70 people online on a regular basis, a majority of them connecting via the web client. Now this web client, the Syndom-specific web client is a bit more up-to-date. You'll notice that this hasn't been updated in 3 years, but it does work. It requires some specific configuration and a little bit of JavaScript and Node knowledge to get working, but once you've got it, it's actually a really great way to allow players to connect to your game. I won't discuss exactly how to install it in this video, maybe in a future video. You can always reach out to me if you're interested or having trouble. So we just know that we are connected to this web client. Now, when the MOO was originally created, there were not a ton of ways. You didn't really have clients so much. People were literally connecting via Telnet. Telnet, you open Telnet and then you type like open game domain name and then the port. It's not an optimal way to connect. These days we have much better technology. It used to be that you'd have to edit the verbs that you're using on your objects in the game itself, which could be a bit cumbersome and hard to figure out. So I'm going to walk you through how to do that, and then, because I think everyone should know it, and I'm also going to walk you through using the web client to do those things. So let's see. First things first, creating objects. So you can do help at any point, and then you can do help building, which will give you some things for creating new rooms, and things like that. You can also do help programming, which will give you a list of help files that you can reference in order to get information about what you're coding and how to set arguments and list verbs and list the contents of a verb or the actual verb code. I'm using the word verb, which when you're dealing with objects, right? A verb would be something like get. So if you have a verb called get on a room or on an object, and your player references that, they would be referencing or calling that verb, and specific information will be provided to the program code that's running about the player that referenced it and any specific arguments that they passed in. There is a MOO programming guide. I will link to it in the show notes. It goes through a lot of this stuff. I recommend you read it through a couple times and then watch these videos, because then the videos will make a bit more sense, because I'm definitely going to miss some things and I'm not covering the ins and outs of every little aspect of MOO programming. So, let's see. First verb. We need to create an object that we're going to do things with. To know what objects we can even create, we've got to see what objects the game actually has already. So you can do @parents me. This will show your parentage. I am a wizard number 2. Now if you're connected to LambdaCore, you'll just default to being a wizard when you connect wizard. You can add your own login and stuff like that. My parent is generic wizard. Then the parent of that is generic programmer, generic builder, Franz player class, generic mail receiving player, generic player, and then the root class. So let's see. We don't want to create another player object. We want to create something of a different parentage. So let's do @kids number 1. That's the root class. And that's going to show you all of the children of number 1. You'll notice there's a generic room, a system object, generic thing, generic player, generic exit. And let's see if we can find a good parent to create something off of. You know what? There doesn't seem to be one. We'll just create one off of the root class. So if we do @create number 1 named test object, we should now have a test object, and it tells us the object number. The object number is very important. It's the reference to the object. So if I did semicolon, which is an evaluation, you're evaluating MOO code on the command line, it tells me test object. If I do @parents number 97, you'll see test object is a child of the root class. And if I do @kids number 1, I should see test object right here. @kids, @parents, they are verbs that are on me. So if I wanted to see what verbs I had, I could type @verbs me, and I have no verbs defined on me. Now this is a little confusing because I certainly have verbs. I mean, I have the command @verbs, right? Well, it's showing me the verbs that are specifically defined on me. Since this is object-oriented programming, the verb @verbs could be defined on one of my parents. Now if you look up here, these are my parents. I could go through and type @verbs number 57 to see the verbs on the generic wizard. Now maybe @verbs shows up in here. There's a lot and it's not exactly formatted super nicely. Or a quick sort of hack to figure out where a verb is defined is to type @list the object that you want to check for the verb. In this case, I'm going to use me. Me is a special alias you can use. Actually, that won't work. It will work in an evaluation, but it won't work. I don't believe it will work. @list me @verbs. No, I guess it does. All right. So me is just a reference for yourself. So you can see that object number 2 does not define that verb, but its ancestor number 58 does. Now if you look up here, where's number 58? Makes sense, generic programmer. So this just listed the contents of this verb. So when I type @verbs, it is going to execute this code. Now I'm not going to go through every little bit of code here, but just teaching you @list is important. you'll notice that it has line numbers. If you don't want those line numbers, you can do without numbers. And we can get that. Now this is great if you want to copy and paste this into Sublime or another text editor, do your editing, and then come back. Now say we'd done that. Say we then wanted to program this verb. We'd made some change and we wanted to actually store it in the server and then execute it, right? So let's do that. Let's copy and paste this over into Sublime, and we will do this. I'll just close these out. Don't save, don't client, set task forms player. Okay, so right here we've got our verb code. Now let's say I want to add a little message saying, hey, you're checking verbs. I can do player tell. Player is going to be the person who's responsible for executing this verb. I'm executing it, so whatever my object number is will be stored in the player variable. A lot of this stuff is detailed in the MOO programming guide. You are editing a verb, or no, you're not editing, you are checking verbs, right? So I've just edited that verb, right? I can come back to the MOO and I can do @program, or I think @prog works, number 58 @verbs. Now it's telling me now programming generic programmer @verbs, and it's saying type lines of input, question mark for help, and end with a dot. Really what you need to know here is that you can paste all this in, and then when you're done, you hit period, and it knows that you're done. Now let's see what happens when I do @verbs number 58. You were checking verbs show up. Fantastic. We just updated some MOO code. So what I recommend as a good starting place is parenting yourself, then going through the list of verbs that, or @verbsing your parents, and listing these verbs and trying to see what they do. Start to puzzle out how they work together to do things. Let's go back over here. So we talked about @parents, we talked about @kids, we talked about @create. Let's talk about actually adding a verb. Say we wanted to add a verb to ourself, right? You can do @verb me. Now you could also do the object number, right? @verb, what am I, number 2? I could do @verb number 2. You'll notice @verb, not @verbs. @verbs is to list the verbs, @verb is to add a verb. So @verb number 2. What do we want to call our verb? Let's call it say hi, right? Or @verbs hi, right? I use @hi because I think it's a good policy to add verbs that are, you'll notice there's a lot of these ones. This is a convention. It's basically just a naming convention. If you're creating a verb that should be run directly, meaning like I'm going to run this by typing @hi, right? As opposed to a verb like prog option, which is run internally. It's a verb that my verb might call, right? So it's not a player executable verb. I would not necessarily add an @ to that. So since I'm going to be executing this, I'm going to add an @, and that will signify that this is something that is player executable, not necessarily by everyone, but by the person who defines the verb. So @verb @hi. Now, after you've defined the object number and the verb name, you define the direct object, preposition, and indirect object. So for example, you could do @hi any, meaning you'll accept anything in that place, then a preposition string like in, and then an indirect object like this, right? So another example would be like put. Now, put, I didn't put an @ in front of it, and typically that's because this is an in-character command, at least in Syndom or in my experience. An @ command is like an out-of-character command that you're running as you, and put is a command that would be executed by a player directly, but that is considered in character. So like I'm going to put something in the game into something else. Like if I had a briefcase, I could do put some object in this, if my object that I was creating this on was a briefcase. So let's let's try that out. So at put any in this, we'll do that. And then the next is like the execution permissions. So we're going to do R and X. You can do RxD. I typically do RxD just because that's been my habit. D for debug, X for execute, and R for read. So there's at verb number 2 or hashtag 2 put any in this RxD. So the verb was added. Now I can do at prog to prog the verb, right? So at prog number 2 put, and it's telling me I can write the code. Now you could write it right here and paste every line in, or you could go into Sublime and do it like that. So in Sublime, we'll just player tell you are putting string in here. So this is just a very basic example. You're putting direct object string in here. Now dobj string, this is again covered in the MOO programming guide, but there's some reserved variable names in when you execute a verb. There's args, there's dobj, dobj string, iobj string, prep string, and a few others. So at least I think a few others. Check the MOO programming guide for more information on that. So we're basically saying you're putting dobj string in here. Now what do you think is going to happen when I execute this? So if I type I can see, or I, or inventory, or inv, you can see what I'm carrying. So I have test object. So if I do put ASDF in test object, it says that, right? Now why did that happen? At verbs test object definitely does not have that verb. Now why did that happen? That's because I defined it on myself. So if I do at verbs number 2, there we go. At list me at copy move. So there is a verb called at copy when you put something in the wrong place. It's at copy. A lot of verbs that are built in with the core will have usage like this at the top. So you can also do at help or help at copy, and you should see some syntax and information. This is actually probably a help file, but okay. At copy move number 2 put to test object put. I don't understand that. Number 2 put. So to test object put. So I move that verb. Now if I go back up and I do put ASDF in test object, you're putting ASDF in here. So you'll see that direct object string, or what we defined as any, was placed, whatever we pass in there was placed into the direct object string variable. So if I do put YOLO in test, you'll see that. You can also reference things by their alias or partial verb names, or I'm sorry, partial object names. So you're putting YOLO in here. So we just created a very, very basic verb for putting an object in another object. Obviously it doesn't really do anything and has accomplished 0 except for to tell us that it was doing that. But you kind of are starting to see the point, hopefully. When you create a verb, like we said, you can do at verb object verb name. You can use the object number or a reference to the object, or you can use, if the object is on you, you could use the object name. Now I don't recommend doing that. Like I could do at verb test object ASDF this none this RxD, and that worked. So if I do at verbs test, you'll see that ASDF is on there, but it's really a good practice to use object numbers when you're putting things on objects. That way you don't, when you're putting verbs on objects, that way you don't put it on the wrong object like I did. So you'll also notice I used this none this. Now this none this is how you would define a non-player executable verb, right? It's a verb that is called from other verbs. So if we were to program at ASDF, if we did at prog number 97 ASDF, we could say player tell you just called the ASDF verb, and then a semicolon. Lines are always ended with semicolons except for control structures like if and for loops and such. So I just did that. Now, what if I want to go back over to the put verb and do at prog number 97 put and have it call that ASDF verb? What I can do is do this, which is another reserved keyword referencing the current object, similar to the scope of JavaScript. Whatever object the verb is running on, this references that object. This colon ASDF with no arguments. This will probably look pretty familiar. Sorry if you couldn't read that before. This will probably look pretty familiar for anyone who's done any kind of programming. This colon ASDF parentheses semicolon, and that's it. Now if we call put ASDF, or put DDDDD in test, it says you just called the ASDF verb, right? Now, just to, let's say you wanted to see all the information about an object, you can do @dump test, and it's going to show you everything about that object. Its aliases, this was automatically set when you created. The object size, which is updated periodically. Then the verb information, this is copy and pasteable, so you could copy and paste this from one game to another, a development server to a production server. Has everything you need to create the verb. So you @args put, I'm sorry, without, technically not, because you doesn't have the @verb, but there is a flag, I think, for creation as well. I don't remember what it is. You can @list the @dump verb and get more information. So it @args it and chmods it, it programs it, and then there's another one. So you can see that this verb just calls this verb. So chmod is a great way to, if you forget when you're creating a verb, I do @verb number 97 test. Okay. This verb has no arguments and is not executable. I could then @dump number 97 again, and you'll see not only is this verb not programmed, but the arguments are none, 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 and it has not been chmodded to anything. So you can do that later, and you can change things that have already been chmodded. That chmod number 97 test plus rx, right? I can also do -rx plus rx. And I can also set args. So @args number 97 test. Notice it's in quotes here. You can include spaces in your verb names. Or you can, I'm sorry, you can't include spaces in your verb names, but you can alias a verb in different ways. So you could have like if you have a space, if we did @verb number 97, let's call it test 1, test 2, test 3. Oops. Let's make it test 4, test 5, and test 6. And then @verbs number 97, you'll see that this verb is test 6, test 5, test 4. You can reference this as test 6, test 5, or test 4. It's good if you have a long verb name and you want to create a shorthand, like @verb number 97. This is a long verb and TIALV. Right? You can reference it as either one. So again, back to args, @args number 97 test. Well, it's called test 5, and we'll set the args to any. The verb arguments are changed. I can do @list number 97 test 5, and I can see that the arguments are number 97 any. Any will basically say that it accepts any input, right? So back over here, we talked about chmod, args, prog, list without numbers. Let's talk about corifying references to objects. Now, the way I was taught is that object numbers can change, right? An object number is supposed to be permanent, but it technically could change, right? So having a bunch of object numbers in your code is non-optimal, because if that object number did change, was recycled, or you wanted to replace the implementation of that object with another one, you would have to go through all your code and update it, right? So if we did a grep, if you're not familiar with grep, Google it. This is basically just going to search our code for ASDF. There are two verbs in the game that reference the text ASDF, this one and this one. It does not check verb names. It just checks the contents of the verb. So if, say, I referenced in my 97 put, if I did @prog number 97 put, and I did, instead of this, I did number 97 ASDF, and then I called put AAA in test, it still works. I can reference another object by object number. It's still not the greatest, because again, if I now grep number 97, I'll see this verb references number 97. Imagine if I had some implementation where I had a utilities package and it had a verb that I use all the time, and then somebody made a better utilities package, and I wanted to use it, I would have to go and change all my code. It's really important to be forward-thinking, especially if you want your game to be maintainable in the long run. So what you can do is corify references to an object or to a verb. So there's this @corify. Let's see, does it have a help file? No. Well, anyway, properties on number 0 let's just do properties number 0 to list the properties on it. We haven't talked about properties yet. We'll talk about them later. You can also read up on them in the MOO programming guide. There's a property called, let's see, what's a good one? String utils. So there's a prop on number 0. You do @show number 0 dot string utils, and it references number 20. So that's a reference to, if I did @verbs number 20, or looked at number 20, or did help string utils, apparently. This has an incredible number of amazing verbs that if you are smart, you will begin using right away. You can read this help file, you can @list these verbs, and you should use them. The MOO programming language is just a programming language. It does not have a lot of implementations for a lot of the things that you would want, like exploding a set of words based on a delimiter. However, the packages that are included in the MOO, in LambdaCore, have a lot of this functionality. Now, not everything, but a lot. So, you'll notice that it was referenced with a $. $string underscore utils references number 20, which is the string utils object. Confirm that with @parents, string utils, number 20. This is what's called a corified reference. This is much better to use in your code, because if you ever wanted to replace your string utils package, you could just change that property on number 0 to point to another object, and as long as that object, the new object, maintained the same verb names with different implementations, you wouldn't have to change your code at all. So, to corify an object, you can do @corify number 97 as tester. Right? This will say it pretty much every time. I can now reference tester and get number 97. So if I did tester put, it won't work, because this is, again, a player command. right? So if you want to use that, you have to reference it directly on the object. But I could reference the tester ASDF. You just called the ASDF verb, right? Much better way to implement, much better than using object numbers. It's also, like, if you look at object numbers, it's a random object number. It's like, eventually you'll get into the tens of thousands of objects in your database, and that means that you could have an object that looks, 10275. Well, what the hell is 10275? Well, maybe it points to the best utils, or like random utils, right? Well, if your code has random utils in it, it's going to be much, much clearer what your code does when it calls random utils generate number, right? If you just had 10275 generate number, it's going to be rather unclear what the hell that does. So, corify your object references. We talked about corified references, corify. If you want to uncorify an object reference, you could just remove the prop. I think this is a verb, yes. At rmprop number 0 dot tester. Now if I reference tester, I get a traceback. We're not going to talk about tracebacks right now. In fact, this video is pretty much over. I do want to remind you to please check out the MOO programming guide. I've put out an updated MOO programming guide which has semi-nice HTML5 formatting and updated tips and sort of best practices, and it's a little bit more readable than the one that was put out in like 1992, 1993. It maintains the same information while just adding new information on top of it that I've learned in many years of experience. Now, that information that I've added, I try to specify when it's me adding it so that people know whether it's the official LambdaMOO programming guide or additional stuff from me. So check that out. Check out the Domme client. Other clients that have oh, you know what we didn't even talk about. You know what, we're gonna pause and not finish the video. At edit options plus local. This is super important. If you enable this, instead of using the in-MOO editor at edit number 97 ASDF, this in-MOO editor is I'm sure was great at some point. It looks like it kind of does a Vim type thing or an Emacs type thing. It's just really, I can't even explain. I don't know how to use it, and I've been doing this for a long time. Instead of using the in-MOO editor, if you set plus local, then if you use vMOO or Atlantis or a client that supports editing outside the MOO, it will pipe all the data out of the MOO. So now if I do edit number 97 ASDF, I get a pop-up window. Oh man, how nice is this? This is great. So I could just do like player tell, another tell, right? You'll also notice that tell is a verb on me, or on the default player object, right? I hit program, and it just programmed it for me. So it's a much better IDE. This uses Ace.js, which you can enable like really cool stuff like Vim editing or Emacs editing if you wanted to have that in your browser. So I recommend checking that out. So again, this will be in the show notes, but edit options plus local to ship stuff out of the MOO. I still recommend knowing how to use @prog or @program and @list. Those are very valuable. There's also, if you screw up really badly, like if you defined a verb on yourself, @verb me asterisk, that's basically a catch-all. Anything I type now is not going to go through. I've just screwed myself. And I'm on the wizard account, which means that if I did this without knowing how to fix it, your whole MOO is screwed, right? So every command that I type is being routed to that asterisk verb, which is not programmed. So there's only like 2 commands that you can actually, I think .verbs is one. No, it's not. Maybe 1 command. It's listed in the MOO programming guide. I don't know it off the top of my head, but this is very important to know. .program. .program object verb. .program what's my number 2? and the verb was asterisk. So I'm now programming that verb that I screwed up when I added. And I think that if I call pass at args, it will work. Yes. So I've now at least gotten to the point, hopefully, where I can send commands. So if I do @remove verb #2 star, does that work? Yes. So I was able to get out of this tricky situation by using the built-in command to program a verb. The built-in command being .program. You'll commonly use @prog because it gives you a better wrapper around .program, but in the end, it basically just calls what .program calls. So if you ever get into a crazy situation, this has happened to me where I've broken Syndom and I couldn't get any inputs in and things like that, .program will save the day. So try to remember that. That's going to be it for this video. In the next couple videos, we'll talk about a little bit more in-depth stuff and how to create something that will help you debug your applications. And yeah, happy mooing.